I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and I am delighted to welcome you to this second part of our doubleheader with Ed Lotterman. His topic today is Blame It on Mexico City, how Minnesota's lucky Lindy was smitten by his Smithie, and it has implications for the worlds of diplomacy and economics and industry, as he mentioned to me last time. Ed Lotterman writes the Real World Economics column for the Pioneer Press. He has taught economics at the college level and enjoys explaining the dismal science to non-economists. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota with the financial support of Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. And we are deeply grateful to these organizations. Thank you very much. And now let me turn things over to our speaker, Ed Lotterman. Blame It on Mexico City, how Minnesota's lucky Lindy was smitten by his Smithie. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. It's wonderful to be here. I really enjoy these talks, and this is what I want to give. At the same time, I'm filled with shame today because I'm not as ready as I wish I were. And this is an odd presentation in that I have prepared for this longer than any other presentation I've made. And yet now at the last minutes, I'm coming up a little short in what I wished I had had. And I started preparing for this, I would say, in sometime in November, December of 1964, when I came across a book in my high school library by a reporter who had accompanied, and there was sort of a press pool of 5 or 6 people that could jam into a Ford tri-motor airplane and follow Lindbergh as he made a tour of Central America, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And I found the book fascinating, and that introduced me to to Lindbergh's more than just sort of the basic story. I then read Anne Morrow's book, North to the Orient. That was out of my aunt's collection, and it's sort of gone from there. But we have this, Judy and I talked about this. Our title is How Lucky Lindy Was Smitten with His Smithie. But it'd be a little more accurate to say how a young Smithie was smitten by Minnesota's lucky Lindy, because it wasn't symmetric. She was much more smitten with him than he with her. And it was on or just before Christmas of 1927 in the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. And it began a deep and interesting and painful romance that lasted until the ends of their life. She was in her 90s when she died in 2001. And here's 2 pictures of them. One is a young couple married less than 2 years. And another, one of the last photos I could find of them together in their, both in their 70s. And here are 2 more, one from their old age. This the one of the 2 of them together is another one of the last ones of them taken together. And then with John Kennedy, so that would have been when they were in their late 50s and sometime in between 1961 and 63. And they have it's a romance, but it's not a rom-com. There's not a lot of comedy in it. The 2 of them were early international pop icons, celebrities, in a way that we don't really appreciate today. For a time, they were one of the most famous couples in the world, and Lindbergh certainly was one of the most famous men in the world. It wasn't just the United States, it was international. And their marriage was a true romance, but it was a complex one that involved passion and love, courage, adventure, tragedy, mourning, fleeing, infamy, redemption, betrayal, more than we knew until very recently, and perseverance. Both of them were really exceptional in their intelligence and energy, and their union involved true love and deep pain. And this is a picture of Anne Morrow. When she met him, she was in the middle of her senior year at Smith College. where her mother had gone and where her mother was the first woman president, although it was interim, so they don't count her. And I have to, Smith is our family college by marriage. My uncle married a Smithie. And then my mom's sister had her Navy training in World War II at Smith, and my daughter went to Smith, and two cousins have gone to Smith. So we know Smith. But she really was smitten. This is what she wrote years after the fact in a memoir. But the sheer fact of finding myself loved was unbelievable and changed my world, my feelings about life, and myself. I was given confidence, strength, and almost a new character. The man I was to marry believed in me and what I could do, and consequently, I found I could do more than I realized, even in that mysterious outer world that fascinated me but seemed unattainable. And this was written in her diary a couple of days after the banquet at which they met, the Christmas banquet, when Lindbergh took her and a few others up in a plane that wasn't in the Spirit of St. Louis, because that only held one, but there was I believe a Ford Tri-Motor, and he flew it, and there were seats for 5 or 6 people behind. And I believe this was her first flight. She had come to Mexico City on the train and hadn't flown before. I had real and intense consciousness of flying. He was so perfectly at home. He sat easily and quietly, one hand on the wheel. It was a complete and intense experience. I will not be happy till it happens again. So, but it's more than just a love story. And I'm an economist. I have to cram a little econ here. And I was a history major, so I want to cram a little history. So the backstory is that you have two loving families at very opposite ends of the political spectrum. And on the left, you have the Morrow family, and that's a picture taken in Panama just after the canal was opened, probably about 1915. And it's the father, Dwight Morrow, standing, his wife. She's the woman who would later be president of Smith College, and she was a brilliant woman. She read the Old Testament in Hebrew when she was in the 10th grade. That's her mother, who was a widow and lived with them. And that's their oldest child, their daughter Anne, born in 1906, who is the apple of Dwight's eye. And over here we have Charles August Lindbergh and his son, Charles Augustus, who we know as Lucky Lindy. And I think he was born in 1902, so there's 4 years difference between the couple. And these were taken probably about the same time. He's older here than she is there. And they both were interesting families. The Lindbergh family is certainly more troubled than the Morrow family. But here's where the backstory starts. The meeting is in Mexico City. Why in Mexico City? Well, there was much political turbulence in Mexico from the time of its independence from Spain, finally achieved in 1821, until the present. But there was a period of calm, relative calm, under the presidency of Porfirio Diaz, known as the Porfiriato. And there were some little interruptions, but he was in office for 30 years from November 76 to May of 1911. There was a 4-year break and then some shorter breaks. And he was highly favorable to US investors. And US railroads and US mining companies had coveted entrance into Mexico for a long time. They found it very difficult until Diaz's time. They were viewed with suspicion. It wasn't long after the Mexican-American War. And the US and Mexico had very different property rights system. And the United States, it was sort of English common law. And if you own the surface, you own the oil or minerals under it. And Mexico and all the rest of South America had the Iberian codified Roman law principle that if you own the surface, you own the surface, and anything under that belonged to the king. And so just owning the surface ground didn't necessarily mean you could drill a well or buy a mine. And American company simply didn't want that to be that way. And basically Diaz bent and said, and gave them rights that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And it helped a great deal with the economic development of Mexico, but it created great resentment. And there were resentment for many other reasons. There were social resentments, and it broke out in the Mexican Revolution, which ran from roughly 1910 to 1920. And Plutarco Elias Calles, he's the president from 24 to 28, and he followed another 4-year president. So stability had returned. There was Alvaro Obregón, and he was followed by Calles. But Calles was the one who took the initiative of saying we have to restore relationships with the United States. In the Mexican Revolution, a great deal of US-owned business property, mines, railroads, oil wells, and so forth had been expropriated. It had not been paid for. There had been great frictions, and Calles wants to restore things. Now, the problem, William Howard Taft on the left, a man who didn't want to be president, but his wife wanted him to be, and his friend wanted him to be. And he had followed something that was called dollar diplomacy. And that was actually an advance. Instead of, sort of sending in the Marines and treating, our neighbors as colonies, it was to pull back that military intervention and use American banks offering loans as a way to sort of sweet talk countries into doing what we wanted. And I've just finished reading Margaret Macmillan's The War That Ended the Peace, which is about the run up to World War I. And that was happening very much in Europe. The French government would pressure French banks to lend in the Balkans, to lend to Russia and so forth, to forward their foreign policy interests. But it worked, but it's Taft is in from 1908 to 1912, and his approach to diplomatic relations is setting in just as the Mexican Revolution breaks out. And then in 1912, the presidency passes to Woodrow Wilson, who's a very complex man, brilliant, arrogant, stubborn, racist, sort of a very complex man. That's a phrase I use about my mother. But his famous statement was, the Mexicans must learn to elect honest men. And we have some incursions. There's a expedition sent off, including George Patton sent off chasing Pancho Villa, and the US Navy seizes the main Caribbean port of Veracruz and holds it for about 3 months. That's long enough for the Navy and Marines to earn 56 Congressional Medals of Honor, which was more than the 45 they'd earned in the Boxer Rebellion, but about a seventh of what has been given for Iraq and Afghanistan. So relations are in a mess. By the time Wilson is out of office in 1920, and we have Warren G. Harding and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, who was a brilliant mining engineer, self-made man, had worked in China for years, had run food relief for Europe during World War I. A brilliant, capable, ambitious man. And then we have, after Harding's death, we have Calvin Coolidge, who was pragmatic, not exactly a ball of fire, and always resentful of the fact that his commerce secretary thinks he could do a better job than Coolidge, and he probably could have, although he failed when it came to his turn from 1928 on. But they both, Hoover thinks it's essential that U.S. business and finance interests get things straight, settle whatever fight they're having with Mexico and come to some agreement and then move on from there. And Coolidge agrees. He's a very pragmatic man. And so they need a solution, which is a new ambassador. And the solution is a man called Dwight Morrill. And he was he was from a comfortable middle-class family. His father was president of a small college. It's now Marshall University. He went to Amherst, where he was a classmate of Calvin Coolidge. He went to Columbia Law School. He was what was called a white shoe attorney, one of the high-class Wall Street financial attorneys. And he became a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company by 1913. Then he was the top civilian aide to General John J. Pershing and the American Expeditionary Force in France. Coolidge asked him to head up the Moral Board, which looked at, there was quite a kerfluffle over Army aviation in the 1920s. There was an Army pilot, Billy Mitchell, who'd been in World War I and thought the Navy was obsolete and so forth, and was insubordinate. It resulted in Mitchell's being court-martialed. And White Morrow was called into, let's smooth things over, let's look at it, and let's get some sort of planning for the future. And basically the Morrow Board came up with the solution of a separate US Army Air Forces that became the US Air Force. So he was a fixer, and he was a guy to send to Mexico to settle things down. And eventually he became a US Senator from New Jersey. Now there's a little anecdote, and it may seem to be chewing up time, but it brings in some other economics, and it put things in context. There's a famous little anecdote among small people, a small bunch of nutty historians. But there was a WASP plutocrat who offended a German-American Jewish plutocrat. And the WASP plutocrat was J.P. Morgan Jr. This is J.P. Morgan Sr. His father, Junius Morgan, had founded the Morgan Bank, and J.P. Morgan Sr. had really made it what it was. This was his, and then there's his daughter, and then his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., often known as Jack. And Sr. had died in 1913, but Jack was living and was running the firm. So he's the WASP plutocrat. Then there's Jacob Schiff. Schiff was born in Hamburg, came to the United States. He was the head of the investment bank Kuhn Loeb, which eventually, with other things, was melded into Lehman Brothers and disappeared. But it was one of the most important banking houses on Wall Street in the first decades of the century. And the two of these, sometimes they were partners and sometimes they were rivals, but especially they financed Edward Harriman, who had the Union Pacific Railroads, and they financed James J. Hill from St. Paul, who had the Northern Pacific and the Burlington and Quincy. And they got along well and they respected each other. But I have here, I put German American in a larger font and Jewish. Back then, there certainly was anti-Semitism, but the being a Jew or not was not as important in World War I. And Jacob Schiff was seen as being German American much more than being seen as Jewish, even though Kuhn Loeb was the investment bank for Jews. But what happened was the Cunard liner, passenger liner, the Lusitania, was sunk by a German U-boat on May 7 of 1915. And it was built a bit before the Titanic, sailed a few years after, and the Titanic was huge, but it was ugly and slow and out of date technologically. And the Lusitania was beautiful and fast and technologically right up to date. And it was really the apple of the British Merchant Navy's fleet, out of the British government's fleet. The Royal Navy had subsidized it heavily, and it was torpedoed by a German submarine as it was turning into the Irish Sea off the southeast coast of Ireland. It sank in 18 minutes. It took the Titanic something like 4 hours to go down. And 1,195 of nearly 2,000 total people on board died. 128 of 139 US citizens, 94 of 124 children. 31 of 39 infants. And one of the technological advances of the Lusitania was that they had a nursery with nannies and nurses. And the bassinets were described as Moses baskets. They were designed to float in case the ship went down. And they did for a while, but nearly all the kids that were in the Moses baskets died, and only a few who were with their mothers and got into the lifeboats. So this is sunk, and it is world news. Will this bring the United States into the war or not? It causes shock in England, and it causes shock in the United States, and especially in New York. And the Morgan family is really Anglo-American. They made their start selling American bonds for canals and railroads to the British. They all spent time. J.P. Morgan lived in England for something like 5 years. They all go there, repeated a couple of times a year. They own houses there, whatever. So they are hurt. They're in mourning. There were friends of theirs that went down in the Lusitania. And Schiff realizes how painful this must be. And so he gets up from his office and walks over to the Morgan office and presents himself to Jack Morgan and bows his head and said, Jack, I'm here to give you my condolences on the friends you've lost, on the terrible tragedy of the sinking of the Lusitania. And Morgan responds with some vile answer. I'm sure other people have heard it, but nobody recorded it or is willing to say what it was. And Schiff is taken aback, and he nods and turns on his heel and stalks out. And then Morgan, realizing he's been very rude, turns to his principal managing partner, he's not a member of the family, but he's by now the number 2 guy in the business. They had a big partners room with all the partners' desks together, and his face faces Dwight Morrow's. And Morgan turns to Morrow and said, "Did I?" And Morgan just takes a piece of paper and writes on it, and without saying anything, hands the paper to Morgan. And he wrote on it, "I do not this for your sake, O house of Israel, but for my name's sake," which is from Ezekiel 36:22. And Jack Morgan takes it, reads it, and said, yes, you're right, grabs his hat and his cane and rushes out as fast as he could on his arthritic legs to try to catch up with Schiff to apologize. Now, it's a long anecdote, but we're going to come back to it. Dwight Morrow's strongest suit was to learn how to bring peace and to suggest moderation and to minimize conflict. And that, and there's some historical debate exactly why he chose that. Was it just something pragmatic? Listen, Jack, you're going to give J.P. Morgan a bad name, so go and apologize. Or was there something in it dealing with the fact that Schiff was Jewish? But anyway, Dwight Morrow is an important person. Born in West Virginia, graduate from Cal, but this was up. But he's named U.S. ambassador. He's principled, honest, thoughtful, conciliatory. He's a problem solver. And he's also known as a caring husband and a kind, doting father to his children. Now, as ambassador to Mexico, he sent there in 1927, early in the year. And his job is to do what Hoover and Coolidge want him to do, to restore U.S.-Mexico business and financial relationships. And the second day there, a workman comes and with a crowbar and pries off the sign that says American Embassy, and they put up that says U.S. Embassy. And that may not mean anything to Americans, but everybody in the Western Hemisphere is an American. And Mexicans are Americans, and Brazilians are Americans, and Canadians are Americans. And it is at some level resented that we claim American for ourselves, but to change that to US was saying, I am sensitive to what might be offensive to you, and whatever might be offensive to you, even little things like this, a sign that has been there for decades, we will change. He starts holding breakfast meetings with the president, the foreign minister, and the finance minister, very not structured diplomatic things, but come over to the American embassy and we'll have bacon and eggs and toast, not huevos rancheros. But they just start talking over the issues. He opens the embassy to many more people. He hires Diego Rivera to paint in it. He and his wife buy a little house in Cuernavaca, and they have Diego Rivera, paint that. He invites many more people to functions. They go out to art shows and concerts and whatever. They buy folk art. And he starts bringing US celebrities. He brings Will Rogers to go around with him as he goes around Mexico. And Will Rogers is going to write favorable news stories back about Mexico. And people in Mexico are interested in, the educated people, elite anyway, or just meeting Will Rogers. And this was totally outside of his task list. But there was a revolt going on, basically in a rural area against the extreme anti-clericalism of the Mexican government. And it was the Cristero revolt. And it had gone on for some years, and it was bloody. And some of you may know it. If you've read Graham Greene's book, The Power and the Glory, about the whiskey priest, that's about the Cristero revolt. And because it becomes apparent to the Mexican government that Dwight Morrow was such a good peacemaker, he gets called in to settle this. It involves having a treaty between the government of Mexico and the Vatican, among other things. But he successfully does that. And he really does a reset of US-Mexican investment and commerce. Now, the other half of the equation, the dad of the dad instead of the dad of the dad of the groom instead of the dad of the bride, Charles Augustus Lindbergh. And I think this is a good a picture of his character. He was born Carl Manson in Stockholm, Sweden in January of 59, but by mid-59, he with his mom and dad are in Melrose, Minnesota. And I realize you can't say bastard anymore. This is a direct quote. Someone described him as a real bastard in more ways than one. The problem was that his mom was 19 and the mistress or girlfriend of his father, who was 30 years older than her. And his father had a family back out in the country with a wife and I believe 5 other children. And the father was a fairly well-to-do landowner, but not someone from the historic landowning class. And the Swedish Parliament, or Riksdag at that time, it was like the French Parliament with 4 estates. There were the nobles, the clergy, the burghers, and the peasants. And Charles Augustus's father was a peasant, but he had businesses. He was quite enterprising. However, there was a little problem of bribery and perjury, and he decided to get out of Dodge, and he went with his girlfriend and the baby and left the wife behind. So he came out of a troubled family, and his families were troubled. He was married twice. He was married, had 3 daughters. One of them died, and then his wife died very tragically in 1898. He marries again in 1902. The second wife is Lucky Lindy's father. He had a very complex relationship with his son. Sorry. He's a lawyer, University of Michigan. He's the Morrison County, Minnesota county attorney. He's in the US House of Representatives for that part of Western Minnesota for 10 years. He supports Theodore Roosevelt as the Bull Moose candidate running against Taft in 1912. And that puts Woodrow Wilson in the White House. In 1916, he's a serious candidate for US Senate from Minnesota. In 1918, he runs for Minnesota governor and he's endorsed by the Nonpartisan League. And in 1924, he's the Minnesota Farmer Labor candidate for the Minnesota governor again. Now he's a populist, outspoken, harsh critic of the money trust. There was great populist opposition to the establishment of the Federal Reserve Act, and Charles Lindbergh was one of the strongest, most voluble, outspoken opponents of the Federal Reserve Act. In fact, in his last session, in his last term in Congress, he introduces impeachment proceedings against Federal Reserve Board members, including Paul Warburg. And he also is an outspoken critic of U.S. involvement in World War I. So that once we finally declared war, his writings, his books, his pamphlets were seized as seditious, and it was prohibited to have them. But for those of you who know a bit about Charles Lindbergh and his America First involvement against U.S. Involvement in World War I, well, he got it honestly from his dad. Now, here's where the rub comes between Dwight Morrow and his family and Charles A. Lindbergh and his family. It's this guy Warburg. Like Jacob Schiff, he's a German-American Jewish banker. He's from Hanover. He's the guy who designed the Federal Reserve System. It gets put in a bill that's sponsored by Nelson Aldrich, who's Nelson Rockefeller's paternal grandfather, and Carter Glass gets there's a bill with his name on it, but basically Warburg designs the Federal Reserve System. He's very internationalist. He is a founding member of the College on Foreign Relations. He becomes a U.S. citizen, but he hadn't come here until he was in his about 30. He came in the 1890s. But he's a friend and a counterpart of Dwight Morrow and J.P. Morgan Jr. I mean, that's the milieu he works in. Now, his wife, remember Jacob Schiff, the Kuhn Loeb guy who was insulted? Well, Warburg's wife and Schiff's wife are sisters, and they're both daughters of Solomon Loeb, the founder of Kuhn Loeb. And Paul's brother, Felix, is married to Jacob Schiff's daughter. And their older brother Max is back in Hamburg running the family M.M. Warburg. And he goes and has chats with Kaiser Wilhelm, and he has chats, with the head of the Socialist Party in Germany. I mean, their older brother is a power mover in German politics and German finance. And so if you wanted to sort of pick up anybody who's a member of some sort of international establishment and money conspiracy, it's Paul Warburg. And just a little tidbit. Why do you think Daddy Warbucks of the Lanny is named Warbucks? It's a takeoff on Warburg. So here are the happy fathers. But we have to now leave that and focus a little bit on Lucky Lindy, because he is world famous when he comes to the banquet in Mexico. And Morrow is a shy, bright, but quite shy senior at a women's college in Northampton, Massachusetts. Now Lindbergh's mother and father didn't get along. She wanted a divorce. He insisted they not divorce. So they stayed together, but they had two houses, one for him, one for her in Little Falls, one for him, one for her in Washington, D.C. When Charles is old enough to go to the University of Wisconsin, she goes with him and keeps house for him, and then moves to California. And Charles is an engineering student for a year and a half at Madison, but he finds aviation much more fascinating, and he doesn't want to spend the rest of the time to get a bachelor's degree. So he goes into flying and he becomes a barnstormer, flying from from small town to small town, doing acrobatics and giving rides. He did go, there was an Army training school, essentially for Army Air Force's reservists. And so he goes to a year-long school and graduates in 1925, and he's a lieutenant essentially in what would now be the Air Force Reserve. And he's also doing miscellaneous flying. And the government decides to subsidize aviation, both flying companies, airline companies, and the manufacturers, by making flying airmail very lucrative. And so there are these airmail contracts given out that pay well. And so the companies the contracts are hiring pilots. And most of the airmail was flown at night. And this is before they even have lighted runways or any navigation systems. So it's quite dangerous, but it was sort of take off from today's mail from Denver and fly it to Omaha, and if it's still dark when you get there, well, hope there's a good moon. Lindbergh has to bail out of these planes twice within 1 year when he's somewhere up at night and can't figure out how to get down. But there are a bunch of young people. Lindbergh's here on the right. They form friendships. Some of these people know each other, and some of them die. But he gets into this flying milieu. This is him. He did barnstorm in 1923. He came to Little Falls barnstorming, and this is his mom, and he gave her a ride. Now, enter a guy named Raymond Orteig. He's born in France, came to New York, opened a restaurant and then a hotel. He's a wealthy individual. And in 1919, he offers a prize for someone who can accomplish a flight. And now this is if you want to be picky, this is the important thing about Lindbergh's flight. It wasn't just that it crossed the Atlantic or that he crossed the Atlantic solo, but it was the first flight from New York to Paris. And that's much further than just, say from Ireland to Newfoundland. And the flight at the speeds the airplanes could do would be so long, 30 hours or more, that you'd have to have two pilots. But Lindbergh is fascinated by it. I wouldn't say that he thinks it's easy money, but this picture is taken after he won. That's the only picture of Orteig and Lindbergh. But Lindbergh decides he's going to do it, and he's not a famous aviator, and other famous aviators have tried and failed, and some have tried and died died in failing. And this is the route he has to take from New York, from Long Island, a great circle across the North Atlantic, essentially tracing the eastern coast of Canada and over to there. Now, the problem is, how do you get there? And so the Ryan Aviation Company builds this airplane for him, which essentially is a huge gas tank with a wing above it and an engine in front. And if you've ever looked at the replica of it in the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport, I think it's still hanging there, there's no windshield. You can't look out the front, and the reason you can't was because there was a gas tank. So he had a little periscope, and then he'd have to lean out that window and navigate or fly by that and take off and land by leaning out that window. It was a flying gas tank, and it was a flying bomb in case it crashed. And everything was, it was an airplane optimized to fly 3,000 miles across the North Atlantic, and it was good for nothing else. But there he is with it, and it has the fancy engine turning on the cowl up here, but no windshield. And it was muddy at Roosevelt Field on Long Island on May 20, and so people had to help get it going. But he made it to Paris 33 hours later. This isn't a pose photo, but it was dark when he came in to Le Bourget Airport, and this was taken when he was flying back out of there a few days later. And it was, the word had been sent by telegraphed that he was coming. He'd been seen flying over Ireland. And so there was the largest traffic jam in Paris history, supposedly, of people coming to the airport to see him land. And he had a little bit of trouble localizing the airport because there were all these streets with headlights on them, all pointing into this black spot. And he wasn't sure if the black spot was the right place. And for a little trivia for the trivia buffs, two of the many famous people actually came. If you were in Paris, you went. But I think the oddest couple who showed up to watch him land was Jawaharlal Nehru, who had become the head of the independence of India, and his daughter Indira, later to become Indira Gandhi. I'm not sure if Ho Chi Minh was there or not. Now, it took a while for him to get back to the US, but when he did, I don't think there was a media event since then that has people around there's a platform for press photographers, and I believe this isn't the Lincoln Memorial. I think this is some platform set up, but there's a platform for the press photographers, and I believe there's something, some sort of dais platform prepared for him to preside or be honored at in Washington, D.C. And if I were better prepared, I could take you through many pictures of his being received in New York, being received in Seattle, being received in Chicago. But there was a wealthy copper mining and refining family, the Guggenheims. They have the Guggenheim Museum and Peggy Guggenheim's Art Museum in Venice and so forth. And they set up a trust or a fund to promote aviation, because the government under Calvin Coolidge didn't believe in subsidizing anything. Somehow they got the airmail subsidy through. But Guggenheim thought it would be good because Lindy was such a megastar for him to travel around the United States. And so Guggenheim said they would pay all his expenses and a stipend. They were hiring him essentially just to fly around. And so this was his route. And again, if I were more organized, I'd show his landing in Minneapolis, his landing in Fargo, his landing in Sioux City. But this was, sort of publicity reproducing and creating more publicity. The more he flew and the more there were hundreds of press photographers following, press writers and photographers. The more stories that get published, the bigger the crowds are, the more reporters. And so it turns into this huge publicity event. And alert Dwight Morrow down in Mexico City, who was done well by having Will Rogers down, says, gee, could we get Lindbergh to come to Mexico? That would be good for American prestige. So they arranged the flight of El Espíritu de San Luis. And this is arranged with the State Department, and I believe the State Department essentially takes over from the Guggenheims. So they come from Washington on 13 December 27. They land in Mexico City and stay there and leave on the 28th or so. And they go to Belize, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, and so forth, Panama, Cartagena, Bogota, Caracas, the Virgin Islands, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Havana, and then back to St. Louis. And this is the tour at the first big stop in Mexico City, where Lindy meets his Smithie. Now, unfortunately, nobody took a picture at the banquet. And nobody said, hey, Lindy, get together with Ann, let's take a picture of you. But this picture does, there are pictures of Lindbergh standing by a plane at the airport and so forth. But this picture is of Lindbergh. And that's Dwight Morrow and some American military and then some Mexican police and so forth. And I'm not, perhaps this was very cynically staged, but basically they opened up the garden of the lawn, the lawn of the U.S. Embassy, and invited people in. And the little girl that Dwight Morrow is holding against his knee doesn't have shoes on. So it wasn't that they carefully selected, debutantes from the upper crust. They opened the gates and asked people to come in. Do you want to meet Lindbergh and have your picture taken here? And that was Dwight Morrow. Now, the two of them get married. We're jumping a bit ahead here. The two of them get married, in May of 1930. No. They get married in May of 29, I'm sorry. And he teaches her how to fly. She gets the first woman to get a glider pilot's license. She solos and flies by herself. She gets a balloonist license. And he's keen to continue with sort of exploratory flights that are also adventures and that set records. And so he gets a new airplane from Lockheed. And it's only 2 years after the Spirit of St. Louis, but the technological improvements are great. And they get it in April of 1930. And within days, they want to make a flight from San Diego to New York City and break the record. And so here is Charles and his wife, Anne, ready to get in the plane in the evening in New York, in San Diego, and they're going to fly east. And they have this is a test, electrically heated flight suits because it's open cockpit. And it's dual control, so he'll fly, and she'll be behind him, but she can fly too when he needs to rest. And she operates the radio. And in those days, operating the radio was Morse code. There was no voice radio from airplanes. And you also have an antenna that you have to adjust the length of. It's sort of like a reel from a rod and reel. You have to reel, depending on what frequency you're calling on, you have to reel out wire or reel it in. And she has mastered Morse code. Now, there's something poignant in here that maybe sure people can see. This is the Lindbergh family, and it's Charles and it's Anne, and Charlie's here. She's 7 months pregnant with Charlie, the baby who will be kidnapped and killed. But here they are ready to take off. And these are sort of selfies taken in the back cockpit. And Anne is fairly petite, so there's room for, the controls for her and the radio gear and the reel for the antenna and so forth. And these are pictures taken of her in the back of the plane. They make the trip. They didn't have to go through TSA, so they make the trip in 14 hours and 45 minutes, and that's 3 hours off the previous record. It's a nonstop flight. They're not landing to gas. They fly direct from San Diego to New York. So Charlie is born on June 22, which is Anne's birthday, on her 24th birthday, and there's young bride Anne with her little baby. He's very much a newborn there. And here's a 4-generation picture. Charlie, his mother, his grandmother, and his great-grandmother taken at their home in New Jersey. But, it would be interesting to hear the discussions between them. Adventure calls, and Lindbergh wants to make more exploration flights, and Anne wants to go with him. And they're fairly wealthy people, so they have nannies and so forth. And the mother and the grandmother live there. The baby could stay with them, but they have servants. And so the two of them talked to a guy named Juan Tripp, who was the founder of Pan American Airways, and he sets them off on a Flight to the Orient. And this is the book I read when I was a junior in high school, the book she wrote after this. Much more powerful plane. It has a sliding canopy, which Anne designed this. It's a telescoping sliding canopy so they can both be closed off. And they're going to fly from New York to Japan and then to China. And I have said in previous things, if you want to do anything for your grandchildren, buy them a globe, an expensive one, and a piece of string, and then play games with them, figuring out how you get from one place to another. Leaving New York, going to Churchill, that's straight north of us on Churchill Bay, to Baker Lake, to Aklavit, to Point Barrow, tip of Alaska, to Nome, Petropolovsk, that's on the Kamchatka Peninsula, and then on down to Tokyo, and then to Hankou in China. So you're going up and over. But if you look at a polar projection, the Great Circle Line is pretty much a straight line. If you want to get from New York to China, you basically have to fly across the southern, you have to clip the Arctic Circle. And so here they are. She's invented the telescoping design and had built the telescoping canopy for the cockpit. And here they are at Churchill. They had to do a little, they were there for several days. They did a little work on the plane. Oh, and I forgot, at the very beginning, I had the picture of them on the, standing on the plane, on the wing of the plane at Churchill. And there was a folding canvas funnel there. And this thing has a 480 horsepower engine, takes a lot of gas, but when they're at a place like Churchill Bay, they have to put it in 5-gallon can by 5-gallon can through a funnel, running it through a chamois to get the water out. Here they are at Aklavit. Here they are in Nome, Alaska, and the US Navy is very glad about this trip, but also making sure nobody does anything to the plane. There they are at Nome. And here they are arriving in Ojima, Japan. They left in the 14th of July, and they get to Japan in late August. And they're celebrities. Here are the people as they're leaving the dock where the train is tied up. And there they're walking, and not everybody around them is Japanese, but foreign media. There are American journalists who've gone over there by steamship to be running when they're waiting. There's European journalists, photographers. And so they're pursued by these photographers everywhere they go. And here they're walking around. Anne seems to have had a shtick of keeping her flying cap on. And supposedly she said it was because after flying it, she didn't, couldn't deal with her hair. This was just a way of covering it up. But I think she sort of made it a signature because she wore it practically everywhere, even when she hadn't been in the plane for hours. And here they are, flowers going down one of the main streets in Tokyo. And here's a bit of an aside. They were taken sort of mandatorily to visit the Yasukuni Shrine, the Shinto shrine to Japanese war dead. And that's now controversial because of the war criminals who were buried there. And, if a Japanese prime minister goes there, then Koreans and Chinese react angrily. But the importance of the shrine obviously predates World War II. And the best description of it comes from a friend who grew up in Japan. It's as if we let the Westboro Baptist Church, that's the one that goes and pickets outside of funerals for gay people, if we let the Westboro Baptist Church run Arlington National Cemetery. Now I include this because sort of for groupies or something, for people interested in the minutia, the question has arisen, did Lindbergh help kill Admiral Yamamoto, the head of the Japanese Navy? And the answer was no, but it's more complicated than that. Yamamoto had gone to Harvard. He'd been the U.S. The naval attaché in Washington for the Japanese government. He liked the United States. He spoke English well. He designed Japanese gardens for some people. He didn't want the war, but it was his job. And if they decided they were going to go to war, he would do it. And the United States killed him with signals intelligence, knowing where he would be and sending out planes to shoot him down when he was flying from one base to another in 1943. And it involved US P-38s, land-based planes that had the round trip flight was 11 hours, and they had to take off 3 hours before Yamamoto was going to take off. Their signals intelligence was so good, they knew when he was going to take off, and they had to get their planes in the air before his to meet him. And they meet over this open space out of nowhere, and he's shot down and killed. But so the question arises sort of for World War II buffs, well, when Lindbergh is in Japan and he's being shown all over the place, did he ever meet Yamamoto? Because he was being introduced to everyone at court, and the Japanese Navy was very interested in what he was doing and so forth. And the answer is no. And Yamamoto probably would have met him, actually, except Yamamoto was representing Japan at the London Naval Conference, which was on the limitation of naval shipbuilding. However, Dwight Morrow, Lindbergh's father-in-law, was a delegate to the London Conference and did meet Yamamoto. So historical trivia, but funny trivia. A repeat. Now they were in China, and they had bad luck though. There were flooding on the river. The river was flying very fast. They couldn't tie the plane up permanently. The British had an aircraft carrier there and offered to hoist it aboard. The cables got mixed up, and the thing got flipped on its back into the river and bent and so forth. And so that was November 3, 1931. And Dwight Morrow has died in New Jersey in his sleep. The morning he's found dead the morning of November 5, 2 days later. And so the plane is shipped back for repair in the United States, and they take a steamship and they get to San Francisco, something like November 26. Now this accident is on November 3. And their life this is pretty much the hour of gold that Anne Morrow talks about. And the hour of lead is starting because her dad dies 2 days after this picture was taken. And the baby is kidnapped and killed on March 1 of 1932. So they have 4 months left. They'll get back at the end of November, and they'll have December and January and February with Charlie. And then their life falls apart when the baby is kidnapped and killed. And there's a media frenzy, and things go on for a year. The trial is until 1935. They both have to testify. They're hounded. Their other children, the cars their other children are in are followed by photographers, forced off the road. They have to get armed guards and so forth. So this is really a turning point. Now, unfortunately, well, perhaps fortunately, it's also a place where I'm sort of running out of slides. So maybe I'll just, let me just check, I've got it. Let me just talk about what happens. They have this terrible tragedy of their oldest son, who was 20 months old, being kidnapped. A ransom notice given. They pay the ransom. It's some months. The baby was kidnapped in March. The body is found in May. There's a nationwide manhunt to try to find who did it. The person is finally captured and arrested in 1934. The trial's in 1935. In the middle of that, excuse me, they make another exploring trip. They make a circuit of the Atlantic across to Scandinavia, and let's make this a second presentation in some future year. There are pictures of them at Stockholm International, which is essentially an outhouse beside a dirt strip. There's a picture of them at the airport in Helsinki, which is two outhouses beside a grass strip. But they were doing quite technical work in mapping out routes. And this involved, landing spots and navigation points and finding out about prevailing winds and so forth. And they were gone for 5 months and flew 30,000 miles, the two of them, including they flew over to Europe, around Europe, across the Mediterranean, West Africa, down to Dakar, and they flew across the South Atlantic, and they were the first, I believe, the first plane that flew the South Atlantic well, I take that back. They stopped in Cape Verde Islands, but they were one of the first planes to fly the South Atlantic, and then up. This was sort of the route the Pan Am Clippers would be taking a few years later, up from the eastern point of Brazil at Natal, and then up to the Caribbean, to Puerto Rico, to Florida, and so forth. So they're away from home for 5 months, while the national whatever, the media frenzy about the kidnapping and murder of their son is going on. And it's a way of getting away. Then they're back. They both have to testify. It's very painful for them. The man is Richard Haupt is convicted. He's executed. But they just get worn out by the media frenzy. They have another child. They're going to have a third child, and they flee to England. And that's where we get into issues of, were they Nazis? Did they support Hitler? What did they mean by being in America first? What did they say in this letter, whatever? And so that will have to leave. We're coming right up on the time we should be having questions. We're going to be coming up, but we'll leave that for the future. I did, however, have two trivia things I wanted to share. And one is about the link between the Lindberghs and an event that would be known to you people today. And just a second here. This was the wanted poster for information as to the whereabouts of the baby. Here was leaving the grand jury hearing, and Charles had testified. And there's this kind of interesting gent there, just off to his side. And there's a link between him and something we know, I think almost anyone who might be participating in this would know. And what is it? And if you could read the poster carefully, you might get it, but to save time and have some questions, I'll fast backward to this is Norman Schwarzkopf. He was the head of the New Jersey State Police. He was a U.S. Army general, but he was, in the reserves working at the state of New Jersey. And he headed the whole investigation into the baby's kidnapping. And he was sort of the right-hand contact with the Lindberghs. And here's his son, Norman Schwarzkopf, Jr. Now, for American history, Senior appears again after World War II he spends a couple of years helping train the police forces in Iran. And he, along with the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, are the two guys who carry out the CIA coup that overthrows the elected Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953 and puts the Shah of Iran back in control as an absolute monarch. So an interesting character in U.S. history. The other thing I have to get one little econ thing in. There was an inadvertent trap for the perpetrator. He demanded $50,000 in money, specified the denomination of bills. It was paid out, but history intervened. The money was assembled and put together in a satchel, and it was picked up in the summer of 1932. And Haupt was arrested in 1934. And some of the money was found in between the plaster, in between the studs in a house somewhere. But much of the money had been paid in these bills. Now that's American greenbacks, isn't it? Except these are gold certificates. And what was one of the first things that Franklin Roosevelt and his Treasury Secretary Morgenthau do when they come into office, when Roosevelt is inaugurated in March of 1933? They take the gold certificates out of circulation and everybody has to turn them in. And so Haupt is left holding something like $30,000 in gold certificates that, if he takes to a bank, will immediately raise suspicion. And with that, I think it's time for questions. And thank you for your patience.
Okay, so Ed, oh, great. Okay, I was going to ask you to stop sharing your screen, but you anticipated it. We do have some questions in the Q&A, but we have room for more. So I will say to the audience, now is your question, or your chance to ask anything you ever wanted to know about Lindbergh and Mrs. Lindbergh and her family and his family. And I'm going to start out with a question that I have always wondered. I understand why Lindbergh was grim-faced for much of his life because he'd undergone this terrible tragedy. But I also noticed that even before the kidnapping, I never see a picture of Lindbergh smiling. Anne smiles, he stands there stone-faced. Why is that? Was that just a tick, or was that part of the way, you know, a Minnesotan behaved in those days?
Well, I think he was the strong, silent Scandinavian, the strong, silent type. I think his boyhood was quite austere. His father was a fairly stern man. His grandfather was still living, the guy who had fled Sweden with his mistress. And he seemed actually to be more affectionate than the father, but the father was very stern and judgmental. And but I think he was naturally reserved, and he was not a backslapper. He was not. He flew alone, flying for 33 and a half hours, and he was awake for something like 52 before he actually got this, because he didn't want to do it with anybody else. He didn't want to share piloting, and Anne was the only person he ever wanted to share an airplane with.
That's interesting. Okay, let's turn to the questions. The first question has to do with Lindbergh's supposedly pro-Nazi and anti-Semitic speeches. Were those factors? Our airport used to be called Lindbergh Field. It no longer bears Lindbergh's name. Was his name removed because of his unsavory reputation in the 1930s, or other reasons?
Well, perhaps. I think technically it was the Lindbergh, Termini, and Wool Chamberlain Field. But anyway, okay. I'm not sure about that decision. There was his activities as an isolationist, which really mimicked those of his father. And there's a question as to, the degree to which it was just we don't want to get involved in European war, or we support Hitler.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things. Not all American firsters were anti-Semitic, but if you were an anti-Semitic, you were American first, sort of, and
Yeah.
But they held a big rally at Madison Square Garden, and John F. Kennedy Jr. was there, and he was an enthusiastic America First person. And as far as, Eleanor Roosevelt probably did more for getting away with racism in the United States than any other person of that generation. And later in the war, in 1943, she and Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, who was Jewish, set up a camp for arriving Jewish refugees in Upper New York State. But FDR's political people insisted that be kept quiet until after the 44 election, because if the word were out that Roosevelt was a Jew lover, it would hurt him. So we now have this myth that we went to war to save the Jews, which was just utter rot. We didn't. And anti-Semitism was still very strong. And Eleanor Roosevelt, there were times she would talk about, well, those Jews, those people. So, I mean, there was an element of anti-Semitism that permeated US society. And I think that for us, we should think back maybe about some jokes we made about Polish people or about gay people when we were in college or high school, or that, that some of us made 10 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the nickname Lucky Lindy. According to this viewer, Lindbergh hated that nickname. He felt that luck had very little to do with his successful flight. Do you want to talk about that at all?
He hated it. I believe it was applied to him already in his barnstorming days. But I think it was popularized because there were dozens of songs about Lindbergh that were written after the Paris flight, and more than one of them were about Lucky Lindy. And I think the songs about Lucky Lindy were what made it a term, but he hated it. He hated it. Yeah. And he never got a degree in engineering, but he was a very meticulous engineer and scientist. And, the thing about how his work helped to shoot down poor old Admiral Yamamoto, he put hours and hours into well laid out experiments on fuel economy and flying. And he was there was a National Committee of Aeronautics and something or other committee that became NASA. It was a predecessor of NASA that had the top scientists and the top, engineers. And he was a member of that. He was the youngest member by 20 years, but he was a member of that already, in the 1930s. So he was a scientist and he figured things out. He was meticulous. It wasn't luck.
Okay, the next questioner wants to know if you've read the book, The Aviator's Wife by Melanie Benjamin. Tells the story of Anne Lindbergh, throws a lot of light on her feelings in her marriage and her husband's politics and the submissive role that she felt obliged to take. Have you read the book? Do you agree with that summation of it?
I haven't read it, and so I don't know if I can agree or not. It was a complex relationship. Like her mother, Anne was brilliant. And she was a terrific writer. And her little book, Gift from the Sea, is just a classic.
Yeah.
But her husband was off there in Germany. He would be gone for months and months at a time, on one thing or another. And he fathers 7 other children with 3 other women, And I think all of those 7 children, or 6 of the 7 German Swiss ones, are alive. And there are Reeve, the last of the daughters, born in 1945, was alive. And she's the one, I think, who writes best about her parents and their relationship. I think when I see her explanations, I think she's very insightful. I will look for this book. The one, a poignant thing Reeve lost a baby, a sudden death syndrome, when she was in her late 20s or something.
Mhm.
And her mother came over and said, go in the room where the baby is and hold your baby, because I could never hold Charlie.
Yeah.
But she was a very, very,
Mhm.
get my what? Anne was the polar opposite of Charles in that she was very emotionally sensitive,
Mhm.
and he was emotionally numb, or at least he appeared to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not sensitive at all to what people were feeling.
While we're on the subject of books, there's another question here. What books would you recommend for people who want to learn more? And I will type them in the chat line for those who want to note them down, if you want to give us a couple of titles.
I really can't. I could get you a list and send it to you, Judy, and you could post
Sure.
it.
I would be happy to do that. If you want to do that, that would be fine.
And I mean, there are more recent biographies,
Mhm.
but none come to mind. Now, the children are interesting also. One of the daughters wrote children's books, 13 children's books. One of them was a deep sea diver, and he was a diver in the U.S. Navy, but he also dived on oil rigs, and he was a scientist.
Mhm.
One was an environmentalist. Reeve is a writer. And we know less about the children in Europe, but the Morrow Lindbergh family, there were a lot of writers and a lot of very bright people and a lot of sort of scientific people.
Sure. What was Charles Lindbergh's relationship with his half sisters from his father's previous marriage?
Very interrupted.
Mhm.
They did not get along with their stepmother.
Mhm.
And so even though they were quite young, I think they moved to other relatives after their father married his second wife, after they married Charles's mother. Charles did have contact with them, but it was infrequent and they were not close.
Bruno Hauptmann was executed ultimately for the kidnapping and the death of the baby. Is there any doubt about whether he did it?
And thank me for, I said Richard Haupt, it's Bruno Hauptmann. I think there are slight doubts. I think there's great evidence that he did, but the investigation was very tainted in many, many ways that would not stand up in court today. I mean, there was a lot of evidence that would not be admissible today. So I think it's a fair question as to whether he was or not. But there is substantial evidence that he was.
Yeah. Lindbergh, we now know, had, I believe it was at least two other relationships, two other families.
Three.
Three. Oh my
Yes.
goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. Did Anne know about this during her lifetime?
I think maybe if I had read some of the books that were mentioned that I haven't read, perhaps I would know. And if I read more of Reeve's things, she undoubtedly knew at some point. The question is, did she know at what point did she know? There also is the question, had he cheated on her long before that? And there is substantial evidence that he did, and she knew about it. And there is great evidence that she did have a very quiet 3-year affair with her doctor. I believe sort of like 50 to 53. But Charles treated her badly. I mean, he would just go off, I'm going off to do this, and I'm going to the Philippines, and I'm going to do, he would just go off and walled her and his children out of his life, out of parts of his life.
Okay, here's a comment that has to do with an earlier question about the renaming of the terminal here in Minneapolis. This person says the FAA, or the Department of Transportation, has a standard for naming things like terminals 1 and 2. So Lindbergh became terminal 1, and the Humphrey terminal became terminal 2, and nothing to do with the reputations of the men involved. Do you know that to be true? Is that
No, that sounds right.
sounds right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Good.
wouldn't have been sure enough to have given that as an answer, but that sounds exactly right.
Okay. As someone who has learned of other families in my own family, I wonder, did Lindbergh have relationships with any of his Swedish family or his grandfather or his German family? So his extended family, what were his ties with them?
He had a relationship with his grandfather. There's a picture of him sitting on his grandfather's knee, or with his grandfather, and his grandfather looks much happier or friendlier than his father did. And when the grandfather's wife in Sweden died, the grandfather married his mistress. Until then, they lived in Minnesota as common law man and wife. But before that even happened, as they reached adulthood, some of the old man's, the grandfather's children from Sweden started coming to America. And so, and they were aware of, the circumstances, but these would have been brothers and a sister of Lindbergh's father. And they came to Minnesota, and Lindbergh, there were contacts with them. I don't think that those contacts or relationships were preserved into late adulthood. And he did have, he was close to his mother. And I think that he had contacts with her family, certainly during her lifetime. But I just think he wasn't a touchy-feely family kind of guy. Dwight Morrow was, but I don't think that Lindbergh was necessarily hostile to relatives. But if they were just sort of, I don't think he put a lot of effort into maintaining relationships. And that's just a surmise on my part. I don't know that to be the fact, but that's just what I read.
Yeah. Okay. Someone has asked, please repeat the title of the book that was just mentioned about Anne Morrow Lindbergh. I believe I've cleared that question. I think it was The Aviator's Wife by Melanie Benjamin. And I'm going to, do you remember that, Ed? I'm going to look in the answered column, and I'll type it in the chat line for anyone who's interested. But while I do that, let me let you go on with another question. Is there, or did you have more to say about?
Well, I was going to say, she may have been asking about my mentioning of Gift from the Sea, which is probably Anne's most famous, A Gift from the Sea.
Sure.
But there, I can get a bibliography of all of her books together with some of the other things.
Okay, I'm going to actually put both those titles in the chat line now. And yeah, so the first one was mentioned by a previous questioner. And the second one, which I misspelled gift, I apologize. That's Anne Morrow Lindbergh's book herself, the one that Ed was talking about. Is there any revenue to the Lindbergh family from his legacy and estate?
I don't know.
I do.
Okay.
I actually can answer this question. This is really interesting. My first job a million years ago was working with taxes. And I remember, this was so many years ago, but I remember doing the taxes of a Lindbergh descendant. And I probably shouldn't say more than that. But yes, at that point, which was in the 70s, there was some money. So,
well, they were wealthy. Just from
the wealth come from
book revenues.
Okay.
I think he wrote this little book, We, about his flight, and I'm not sure if he did it himself or he had some help on it. But anything he wrote was a bestseller. And he got consulting fees from airplane companies and from airlines. I mean, when they flew to the Orient for one trip, it wasn't, hey, Juan will help you out. They were being paid quite well by Pan Am Airlines.
Yeah.
And Anne's book sold well. I mean, North of the Orient, was on the New York Times bestseller list for weeks. And so was Hour of Gold, Hour of Lead, and Gift from the Sea, and so forth. And well, maybe he was a little worried about, this rough, my mother's phrase, this rough cob that his daughter had married. But Dwight Morrow, in his wills, made a special set aside $1 million in trust for Anne. And that was carefully isolated so that Charles never be able to touch it. But he was able. Morrow was one of the richest people in the United States by the time he died.
I see. Okay. We're just about out of time. I'm going to try to answer or present as many questions as we can get to. Did Lindbergh have presidential aspirations?
No political aspiration. The son, the aviator, no. The father did, but the son, absolutely not. And I think it was a reaction to his father's political activity.
Yeah. Is the terminal in San Diego still called the Lindbergh Terminal?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't.
All right. And here is a viewer who has submitted a link to a page on the Minnesota Historical Society's website describing Lindbergh's other relationships and his other family. And I'm just going to put that into the chat line as well for anyone who is interested in following up on that. And let's see. All right. Lindbergh was held in high esteem because of his achievements. Did he hold common people in disdain as a result? And do we know the answer to that? Is there any way we know the answer to that?
No, I don't think he did. He had the common touch, and a photo I had at the very beginning, it shows him and Anna standing on the wing of the plane in Churchill. And that's sort of trimmed out of somebody's album. And in the album, it's written, talk to them, not stuck it all up at all, just the nicest people. He could talk to mechanics and things like that. He didn't have disdain for the common people, but he was very much a loner.
Yeah, I see. Which of Reeves, excuse me, go ahead.
I also want to say, just in defense of him, much is made of his, he was a supporter of the Nazis, and you often see a picture of him accepting a sword from Henry Goering.
Yeah.
But Lindbergh went to Germany, sent by the US government to spy on to get information about the German aircraft industry, which he did repeatedly. And he was invited to a party where the US ambassador was at, and this was sprung on him that Hermann Goering comes out and says, here, we have a sword for you, and they're all the photographers. And he said he thought of not accepting, but the US ambassador was there, said he had to accept. It would have been a terrible, diplomatic if he had to accept. So don't take that particular thing as evidence of his, love for.
And I'm afraid we're going to have to end on that note because our time is almost up. Thank you so much, Ed Lotterman. Thanks to the audience, our great audience as always. Thank you, Grayson and Carmi behind the scenes. And for right now, I want to thank you so much, everyone. Thank you very much.